In the early 1900s, Atlanta was a city marked by rapid growth and deep racial division. The 1906 Atlanta race riot, a violent eruption fueled by sensationalist media and systemic racism, left dozens of Black Americans dead, hundreds injured, and the city fractured by fear and distrust. Though the worst of the unrest seemed to pass, Atlanta was about to face even darker and more difficult times ahead: the reign of the Atlanta Ripper. Between 1911 and 1915, at least 20 young Black women were brutally murdered, their throats slashed, and bodies discarded near railroads and secluded areas. In order to understand what the individuals of the time were feeling, as well as how this killing spree came to an end, we need to go behind the headlines. On September 22, 1906, the Atlanta Race Massacre began after white newspapers in the city spread unverified and exaggerated reports of Black men assaulting white women. These reports, filled with inflammatory language, ignited a wave of fear and anger among the city's white population. By the afternoon, the narrative had spread across the city, stoking white anxieties and fueling a volatile mob mentality. The violence was swift and brutal. A crowd of thousands of white men gathered in downtown Atlanta, seeking vengeance. As the day turned into evening, the mob began to roam the streets targeting Black Atlantans. They attacked Black-owned businesses, looted stores, and destroyed properties. The violence intensified when rioters raided barbershops. They killed Black men, also assaulting people and streetcars, dragging Black men and women from the trolleys and beating them. Throughout the night, the mob moved through central Atlanta, attacking anyone they could find. The police, though present, were overwhelmed by the scale of the violence, and it wasn't until the militia was called in around midnight that the mob began to disperse. The violence lasted until the early hours of the morning, with a heavy rain ultimately forcing the rioters to retreat. In the aftermath, Atlanta's Black community was left in shock and fear. Though the riot had been contained, the city's lasting effects were undeniable. Reports on the massacre revealed how the white-controlled press downplayed the severity of the attacks, with only a few Black victims' deaths officially being recorded. While white civic leaders and the press worked to maintain a facade of order, Black residents were left feeling vulnerable and distrustful of the authorities. These emotions and fear and distrust created an environment ripe for further violence, ultimately setting the stage for the Atlanta Ripper's reign of terror. The first suspected murder linked to the Atlanta Ripper occurred on October 3, 1910 or 1909 depending on the source. 23-year-old Maggie Brooks' body was found with a severely fractured skull. While this incident was reported at the time, it's more commonly believed that the Ripper's first true murder happened with the killing of Rosa Trice. Still, Maggie Brooks' death is notable as it set the stage for the brutal killings that would follow. Her murder foreshadowed the series of horrific events to come, marking the beginning of a wave of similar killings that would terrorize Atlanta. As mentioned before, Rosa Trice is widely regarded as the first official victim of the Atlanta Ripper and was attacked in January of 1911. She was found near her home in Atlanta's Pittsburg neighborhood. Her throat was slashed, her skull was crushed, and she had even been stabbed in the jaw. The weapon used in the attack remains unknown. Initially, her murder was not connected to the Atlanta Ripper, as authorities arrested her husband in relation to the crime. However, he was later released due to a lack of evidence. The Black community of Atlanta had little time to recover before another brutal murder occurred the following month. The victim was estimated to be around 25 years old, but was never identified. It was reported she too had her throat slashed. On May 28, 1911, a young Black woman known as Mary Belle Walker had finished her job as a cook for the Lyons family and was walking to her parents' house in the West End neighborhood, but unfortunately, she never made it home. The following morning, her lifeless body was discovered in a field just 25 yards from her home. Her throat had been viciously slashed, and chilling similarity to the other murders linked to the case. The close proximity of Walker's death to her home added to the growing sense of dread within Atlanta's Black community, and her death served as another stark reminder of the continuing danger with the killer still at large, and the violence and fear in the city only escalating in the months to come. Actually, it was just a couple weeks later. On June 15, 1911, Addie Watts was discovered with her head brutally crushed by a coupling pin, a cast iron tool used to connect train cars. Police found one of these pins near her body along with evidence of her throat being slashed, which are, of course, hallmarks of the Atlanta Ripper's attacks. Additionally, there were signs that her body had been dragged to the railroad tracks. What's interesting is that Addie Watts was a neighbor of Lena and Emma Lou Sharp, and it was her tragic death that ultimately compelled Emma Lou to venture out one fateful night in search of her missing mother. On July 1st, 1911, 40-year-old Lena Sharp became one of the Atlanta Ripper's victims. However, it was the concern and quick thinking of her daughter, Emma Lou Sharp, that provided the first eyewitness account of the killer. Emma Lou, a 20-year-old woman, had grown worried when her mother failed to return home at her usual hour. Concerned for her safety due to the recent string of murders and racial tensions in the city, Emma Lou set out to find her mother. During her search, she encountered a large black man who reassured her, saying, "Don't worry, I don't hurt girls like you." However, as they parted ways, the man attacked, stabbing Emma Lou in the back. Fortunately, she managed to escape, narrowly avoiding becoming another victim of the Atlanta Ripper. While there are conflicting reports suggesting that Emma Lou and her mother may have been walking home together, the details ultimately remain secondary. Tragically, Lena Sharp's life was taken too soon, leaving behind a grieving daughter and adding to the growing terror. Now, real quick, although we refer to the murderer as the Atlanta Ripper throughout this video, the killer was not given this name until the Atlanta Journal coined it. And as anticipated, the moniker captured public attention and added a grim notoriety to the series of murders that plagued the city, drawing parallels to England's infamous Jack the Ripper. This name sensationalized the crimes and heightened the fear within Atlanta's black community. By branding the killer with such a title, the press fueled the growing hysteria, framing the murders as part of a larger, uncontrollable reign of terror. But in face of these horrifying events, there was a bit of light. Pastor Henry Hugh Proctor, which was a prominent figure in Atlanta's black community, issued a powerful plea for action. He called on black leaders to unite in finding the culprit and addressing the violence that had claimed so many lives. Proctor's appeal highlighted the shared responsibility of the community to confront the menace, even as tensions between black residents and law enforcement hampered the progress of any investigation. On July 8, 1911, a 22-year-old Mary Yettle was leaving her work as a cook for the Seltzer's household when she soon heard a sharp whistling coming from an alleyway. She saw a tall black stranger approaching her with purpose in his steps, and he quickly began closing the distance. Mary screamed out as she ran back to her employer's home, and Mr. Seltzer soon appeared with a revolver drawn and advancing toward the alley. When Seltzer confronted the man, he momentarily saw him lurking in the darkness before he used the shadows to slip away into the night. The police were, of course, called and attempted to search the area for the man, but ultimately came up empty-handed, and Mary Yettle narrowly escaped the Atlanta Ripper. But sadly, this close encounter with Mr. Seltzer wouldn't be enough to scare the Atlanta Ripper, and the violence showed no signs of slowing down. Just as the community grappled with Proctor's call to action, the body of yet another victim in a series of brutal murders was discovered, Sadie Holley. On July 11, 1911, laundry worker Sadie Holley was found lying in a field near Atlanta University. Her throat had been slashed from ear to ear, and her head was smashed with a rock that was found nearby, and it was covered in her blood. Interestingly, her shoes were missing and were never recovered. Owing to the gruesome nature of her discovery, this marked the first time a victim of the killings appeared on the front page. And for a brief moment, it seemed the Atlanta Ripper might finally be brought to justice. Henry Huff, the last person seen with Sadie Holley and reportedly arguing with her in a cab, had become the prime suspect. A grand jury indicted Huff after investigators discovered bloodstains on his pants and scratches on his arms. However, this unfortunately did not mark the end of the serial killer's reign of terror. Despite Huff's imprisonment for Holley's brutal murder, the killings persisted, and he was ultimately found not guilty, leaving the true perpetrator still at large. Now, if you remember Emma Lou, the woman who narrowly escaped death, She would go on to identify her supposed attacker as 35-year-old Todd Henderson, who coincidentally was also seen in a drugstore with Sadie Holley the night of her murder. In fact, his shoes even matched a print that was found at the crime scene, and it didn't make things better for him when he lied about owning a straight blade after they discovered he had dropped one off to be sharpened at a local barbershop the night after Sadie Holley was murdered. And as convincing as this sounds, it was all just circumstantial at this point. They didn't have 10,000 options for shoes back then, and a man owning a razor to shave was the norm of that day, and Todd Henderson had his case dropped by a grand jury due to a lack of evidence. On August 6, 1911, just weeks after Sadie's tragic death, 40-year-old Mary Ann Duncan was found murdered in a similar manner. Like Holley, her body bore the signs of brutal violence, and the pattern of the murders seemed all too familiar. Mary Ann was last seen leaving her place of work at a local laundry, but her body was discovered shortly thereafter in a secluded area. Her throat had been slit, and she was left in a state of disarray, her injuries consistent with the previous killings. The similarities between this murder and the one of Sadie Holley further fueled the panic in the city, especially as there appeared to be no clear answers or suspects. Now, let's just take a breather and step back to understand the atmosphere in Atlanta during this time. The city was already on edge due to rising racial tensions and the aftermath of the 1906 race riot. And with each murder, the city plunged deeper and deeper into fear, with all of them being attributed to the seemingly impossible to find and impossible to stop killer, the Atlanta Ripper. It wasn't just the fact that people were being murdered, which is cause enough for alarm, but the brutality and the slayings of women like Sadie Holley and Mary Ann Duncan that fueled a growing sense of distrust among the Black community. And to make it worse, the local authorities seemed unable to provide answers, and the press sensationalized the crimes, which added to the hysteria. The killer's apparent ability to strike without warning, leaving no clear clues behind, led to many to question the safety of their homes and neighborhoods. The fear of racial violence was already stoked by decades of segregation and discrimination, and all of this was exacerbated by the grisly murders. With each death, the tension grew, and there was no clear relief in sight. For Atlanta's Black residents, the terror was compounded by the feeling that justice was either out of reach or being systematically denied. After the deaths of Sadie Holley and Mary Ann Duncan, fear within Atlanta's Black community intensified as the body count continued to grow. Eva Lawrence and Minnie Wise became the latest victims in the series of brutal murders that had plagued the city, but it was Mary Putam that had truly, well, freaked everyone out. On November 21, 1911, at 7 a.m., the body of Mary Putam was discovered in a ditch near the juncture of Stewart Street and the Beltline. She was hastily buried underneath loose dirt with her throat and breast barbarically slashed. She was disemboweled, and her heart had been ripped from her chest and lying next to her. And to add to the terror, her body was still warm, meaning this happened very recently. With the Ripper's handprints being found in plain sight in the dirt around the body, bloodhounds were sent out in search of the killer and were hot on the trail but lost his scent after only 200 yards. On April 8, 1912, the body of 18-year-old Mary Cates was discovered with her throat slashed and her body mutilated. The condition of her body suggested that the killer possessed some anatomical knowledge, a detail that was reported by the Leader, a Lexington, Kentucky paper, and further emphasized the chilling precision of the crimes. Not long after, Henry Brown was arrested for the death of the before-mentioned Eva Florence. His wife reported to the police that he had come home several times wearing bloody clothing coinciding with the dates of the murders. However, after a witness testified that Brown had been beaten into confessing during his police interrogation, he was acquitted, leaving the case unsolved and the community once again plunged into uncertainty. However, for reasons unknown, the next set of killings wouldn't be until 1917, at least ones that were attributed to the Atlanta Ripper. This may or may not be the end of the Ripper's legacy, but you'll have to let me know what you think down in the comments. In 1917, the body of Laura Blackwell was found inside her home, and it was stated that she had her throat slashed, with her clothes being destroyed in a fire. For this murder, John Brown was arrested and convicted for her death. It's also believed by investigators at the time that John Brown was responsible for deaths of 3 other women who had been at least partially burned, but still, the killings didn't end here. For over a decade, from 1909 all the way to 1924, Atlanta's black community was plagued by a series of brutal killings. Some of the later killings were attributed to domestic violence, but some still believe it was the Atlanta Ripper. The victims were all young black women who were found with their throats slashed or their heads badly wounded, often with signs of violent mutilation. Despite some investigations into potential suspects like Henry Brown, the killer was unfortunately never caught. The case went cold, and it's sad to say that the legacy of these murders still haunts the community today. The grief of families who lost their loved ones without justice and the fear that remained in the streets left deep scars. I myself can't imagine having a mother, sister, daughter, aunt, or loved one forcibly taken from the world to only be left with a chronic sense of fear for who may be taken next. And while yes, the killings eventually stopped, the mystery around them never truly went away. The Atlanta Ripper was never caught, and the case remains one of the city's darkest and most unsettling mysteries. The terror and uncertainty of those years shaped how the community remembers that time and still stands as a reminder of the racial injustices that were never fully addressed. But personally, I can't help but wonder why the killing suddenly stopped. While there may be no clear reasoning when it comes to the mind of a madman, one can't help but speculate. What if, just perhaps, the Atlanta Ripper went on to lead a completely different life, settling down with a family who remained unaware of his dark past? This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.